We begin Theological Journals by citing St. Paul. If God be for us, who can be against us? Lord, teach us thy statutes. We pick up with Dr. William Edgar in Westminster Magazine, honoring everyone. In many ways, the cultural context of the first century is similar to ours. There are, of course, obvious differences. Thus, the appeal to honor everyone in the apostolic letters was obviously in tension with the great pressure on Christians either to rebel or to conform. It is the same today. Instead of proper respect of office bearers is called for without sacrificing backbone. When Ananias ordered his minions to strike Paul on the mouth, Paul immediately retorted, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Acts 23:3. But then upon learning Ananias was high priest, Paul stepped back with something like an apology. Leviticus 19 commands that there be no partial judgments, but Paul also recognized that one may never speak evil of the ruler of the people. Exodus 22:28. Here's a perfect example of proper honor without compromising principle. My friend Robert Kramer served for 8 years in the Maryland state legislature. Because he was pro-life, he expected considerable pushback from the more liberal deputies. So he decided to spend his first few months on the issue where there was agreement on all sides: the environment, teen drug abuse, and care for the elderly. When he eventually did address the question of abortion, he had the rapt attention from the House. Why? Because he had honored his colleagues and refused to demonize them. At the end of his mandate, one woman told him she was still a liberal, but she was going to miss the way Cranmer honored all his associates, including opponents. Honoring everyone might include a whole range of people, institutions, and even states of being besides government and parents. No doubt one of the most prevalent forms of refusal to honor everyone today is the politics of identity. For example, the contemporary refusal to accept the sex of one's own birth, gender dysphoria, is a form of dishonoring the way we have been made. I realize this issue is fraught with complexity. To move quickly over some intricate ground, we may safely generalize that at least since Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778, the idea of self-love is no longer considered morally evil, but increasingly acceptable. We have our original identity, but it has been shaped and even corrupted by cultural forces, he said. A precursor to psychoanalysis, Rousseau favored going back into childhood to discover one's authentic identity. In a long succession of iterations leading to views Rousseau would not have recognized, movements such as transgenderism argue that we may freely choose to become the opposite sex if that is our true inclination. But biblically, to honor everyone does not mean to bow before such a radical option, but to accept the way we were created. This has tremendous implications. Edith Schaeffer, heroine of mine, often complained of her finitude. Her family letters were full of protests against not being able to accomplish everything she wanted. She was a woman of considerable energy compared to most of us. but it was not enough for her. In her case, she was compelled to reach out to others, that it became frustrating to her when she could not embrace everyone. Most of us would like to accomplish half of what she did. I tremble to suggest that she was not honoring her limitations. This is very difficult for all of us. A few years ago, I had a massive heart attack which nearly sent me to the beyond. Thanks to the Lord's kindness and skill of the surgeons, I am alive today. But I also struggle daily with my limitations as a heart-diseased person. I used to run up and down the soccer field, play numerous concerts, accept many speaking engagements, travel all over the world. No longer. I am still learning to honor my restrictions sent by God's providence. Jesus, of course, is the great model for proper honoring. As a young boy in the temple, though he was the Son of God, he did not, as it were, pull rank on his teachers. He honored the woman at the well despite her lower status in the eyes of society. He honored disciples by washing their feet. In his sobering woes against the scribes and Pharisees, he never suggested that they were subhuman, nor did he tell the people to rebel against them. They should receive proper honor because they sit in Moses' seat, even though they themselves did not practice what they preach. Most tellingly, during his trial before Pilate, he did not call down the legions of angels at his disposal, but endured the cross at Pilate's behest. Jesus shows us how to honor others, just as he shows us to do everything else in the kingdom. In ending, let us go back to the immediate context for the requirement to honor everyone. Peter's guiding principle was live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. The distorted view he was refuting is called antinomianism. This view, widespread then as now, since that my sins are forgiven, it matters little whether I go on sinning. Stated this way, it sounds fairly evident. In Romans, Peter's colleague, the apostle, asks rhetorically if we should keep on sinning that grace may abound. He denounces this with the strongest language. But to the Corinthians in chapter 9 of his first letter, Paul argues rather extensively that he is free. This gives him the right to get paid, take a wife, and receive honor as an apostle. He is not free to go on sinning, but the issue here was of his power. Having established his rights as an apostle, surprisingly, he says he will not exercise those rights. Why? Because freedom is balanced by obedience. No, it is because he does not want to put any obstacle before his audience. He states powerfully, "For though I am free from all, I've made myself a servant to all." These are convicting words. He puts a higher priority on winning others than he does on claiming his rights. When I perform a wedding, I often reference a wise saying. If you get into an argument, it's sometimes appropriate to think, I'd rather be married than right. Does this mean agreement always trumps differences? Not at all. Some issues are non-negotiable, but you get the idea. Think first of your companionship and only, secondly, of your right. When Peter connects freedom with honor, he is doing the same thing. We should honor others because we are servants of others, not because of a set of rules. Whose face is on the coin? Caesar's inscription was on the coin. He should be honored. Where is God's face? It's not on the coin. It's everywhere. When we honor him, we are free to honor all. Reverend Dr. William Edgar, PhD, University of Geneva, Professor of Apologetics at Westminster Theological Seminary. He also holds Associate Professor at the Faculty Jean Calvin. Dr. Edgar's primary and research interests is apologetics. He has spent much of his career developing and applying the tradition of covenantal apologetics to subjects such as theodicy and aesthetics. He is the author of several books, including Reasons of the Heart, Recovering Christian Persuasion. Now we turn to modern Reformation and Dr. Marsden's article on what has become of fundamentalism. He's a scholar on this subject. Previously, he's given us a quick flyover in the 1920s. We pick up there, yet typically also taught in contrast to the liberal social gospel or the civil rights movement, that churches should avoid direct political involvement. That began to change in the later 1970s. Beginning in 1976, when Democrat Jimmy Carter identified as being born again, the news media began to talk about evangelicals as a potential voting bloc. That was possible because most Southern born-again Christians still voted Democrat, and Carter could cut into a bit of the Northern evangelical Republican loyalties. However, strictly conservative fundamentalists and evangelicals who were most interested in political mobilization soon became unhappy with Carter's Democratic Party agenda, especially in promoting more progressive views of the family, gender, and sexuality. That led to the organization of the Moral Majority under the leadership of Jerry Falwell and other avowed fundamentalists. It is also fit with the Republican Southern strategy and helped turn many conservative white Christians into solid Republicans, thereby contributing to the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. For the first time since the Civil War, it was possible to build a nationwide coalition of white political conservative evangelicals, including some who would call themselves fundamentalists, many who would be just evangelical or born again, made up an important bloc in that coalition. Militant opposition to the progressive democratic agenda fueled what became known as the culture wars and has remained an important feature of American politics ever since. Fundamentalists such as Jerry Falwell played a prominent role in building a new militant religious political coalition, but its constituency included a wider variety of conservative evangelicals who were like-minded in their social political views. In continuity with the fundamentalism of the 1920s, one of the emphases most effective in mobilizing the movement was to build on the popular perception that the United States had been a Christian nation but had turned from that heritage. In the new political mobilization, that theme was closely wedded even more widely. Popular patriotism, militarism, and nationalism, resulting in an ardent Christian nationalism. That's probably overstated, Doctor. Now, unlike the 1920s, when anti-evolution was the only national political program, a much broader and more emotionally charged agenda for restoring Christian America became a major appeal to evangelical Christians who had been alarmed by recent cultural changes. Political militancy became a theme in dispensational premillennialism as well. From 1995 to 2006, the Left Behind series of novels by militant culture warriors Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins sold over 60 million copies. One might suppose that ardent dispensationalists who preach that Christ will return within the next few years would care little about long-term political issues. But in the Left Behind series, political battles are at the center of end-time events themselves. The heroes are people left behind when the saints are caught up in the air in the secret rapture, who are later converted to Christianity when they realize what has happened. Their adventures are those of a brave band of Christians fighting the political intrigues of Antichrist and the militant world government. Although many readers of the series were not dispensational premillennialists themselves, they would be drawn by the stories of Christian heroes and heroines fighting the political battles that were recognizable extensions of their own time. In the meantime, the political turn of much of American fundamentalism helped to precipitate an academic development that would soon have a notable impact on the American scene. In the 1980s and 90s, Martin Marty and R. Scott Appleby oversaw a major scholarly study called the Fundamentalism Project, defining fundamentalism to include any anti-modernist religious movement. They showed in a series of major publications that such fundamentalists should be found in just about every world religion. As modernity reshaped societies and threatened traditional religious practices and mores, militantly reactionary groups rose to defend the old ways. These movements often had political agendas. Among them, some of them, unlike what was typical of American fundamentalism, their militancy included literal violence as part of the insurgency. The most conspicuous examples of such movements took place within radical Islam, which was becoming a major world force during the 1990s. Even though Islamic jihadists did not appreciate having the American term applied to them, they were often being referred to as Islamic fundamentalists. That usage came to have a major impact on American fundamentalism after the events of 9/11. Suddenly, the most common usage of fundamentalist was to refer to Islamic radicals, who were perceived as the number one enemy of the United States. Fundamentalists thus took on more than ever the general meaning of religious extremist. That created a problem for many Americans who up to that time had proudly used the term fundamentalist as a self-designation. The term now might be off-putting for evangelism or for building a political coalition, and it needed a lot of explanation. Within a decade, many institutions such as Jerry Falwell's Liberty University and Bob Jones University were no longer employing the term, at least not publicly. Strikingly, the Bob Jones website at present does not use the term fundamentalist in describing itself or in recounting the history of the institution. The use of the term fundamentalist for Islamic extremists reinforce the broader negative implications of the term. Ever since the 1920s, critics such as H.L. Mencken have used the term to mean anti-intellectual bigot. Secularists have continued using the designation to dismiss any sort of traditionalist Christian belief. Meanwhile, more open-minded Christians often used it as a term of opprobrium to designate those who are more conservative than themselves. Philosopher Alvin Platinga, in his Warranted Christian Belief, offers some careful reflections regarding the negative connotations of the term. On the most contemporary academic use of the term, it is a term of abuse or disapprobation, rather like son of a bitch, more exactly son of a bitch, or perhaps still more exactly, at least according to those authorities who look to the Old West as a normative on pronunciation, some bitch. Platinga goes on to observe that such dismissive uses of the term most often target religious conservatives, so that fundamentalist means considerably to the right, theologically, of me and my enlightened friends. After making some more fine distinctions, Platinga concludes, the full meaning of the term, therefore, in this use can be given something like stupid sumbitch, whose theological opinions are considered to the right of mine. Hi, Mario. Good to see you again. They are indeed strong words, something to reflect on. I prefer and use the term confessionalist, thereby avoiding the term fundamentalist, although I am a fundamentalist. Avoiding the term evangelical since it's become so wide, but I'm an evangelical, and I prefer the term confessionalist. So if someone asks, I can point them to the Reformed Confessions. We pick up with Westminster Theological Journal, and the argument here from Richard Cogley about the Puritan New England self-identifying as the New Israel. And he's engaging Berkovitch's, he's a scholar, his argument. In 1986, Henry Stout used the work of both Berkovitch and Lawrence to frame portions of the New England soul and interpretation of religious culture in New England. But as it turned out, the 1980s were a high watermark of specialist support for Berkovitch's argument about typology. Scholars soon recognized that New Englanders did not single out themselves as the exclusive heirs to Israel's chosen status. These critics correctly observed that the Puritans held faithful Christians on earth have been the new Israelites ever since the Jewish rejection of Jesus in the first century, and B, this international community was presently centered in Protestant churches, but was not confined to them alone. On these 2 points, the colonists stood with other early Protestants. Around the time that specialists were retreating from Berkovitch, generalists were discovering him. And he's argued earlier that generalists accepted Berkovitch, but the specialists did not. It's Dr. Cogley's argument. Over the past 2 decades, a number of authors have used his claim about the Puritan self-designation as the new Israel as the starting point for book-length surveys of American civil religion, political rhetoric, foreign policy, and white supremacism, and also for comparative studies of American and Israeli identity. All these studies assumed that the New Englanders bequeathed to later Americans a conviction that God had chosen them for a special place in the world. Thus, the Puritans' supposed self-elevation as the new Israel endured in America, even though Puritanism disappeared as a discernible movement. In one sense, this time lag is unremarkable, for generalists often run several decades behind the specialists. But in another, Berkovitch's enduring appeal requires comment. His argument intrigues generalists because it enables them to connect Puritanism with America's Redeemer Nation mythology, perhaps the only other construct with the same connective power as Governor John Winthrop's declaration in 1630 that the colonists shall be as a city set on a hill, Matthew 5:14. Berkovitch's argument about typology, moreover, is inherently plausible to generalists because he cites so much textual evidence that seems to support it. Puritan sources are filled with such expressions: our American Jerusalem, the New English Israel, American Zion, our Israel. Berkovitch's special critics have rightly concluded that the Puritans internationalized the new term. The critics, however, provide minimal guidance about how to interpret this textual evidence, and in fact make little effort to present the evidence at all. We shift from Westminster Journal to Mid-American Journal of Theology, with this young man who's complaining heavily about literal translations over dynamic equivalence. The relevance of the apostles to this discussion goes beyond their use of the Septuagint. He's been arguing about the Lord of Hosts in the Septuagint, which makes the translational decision as the NIV and extends to actual quotation of this particular translation decision in the Septuagint. In 2 Corinthians 6:16-18, Paul quotes from the Old Testament Greek of 2 Samuel 7:8 and 14, Isaiah 52:11, and Jeremiah 38:1 and 9. This rendering of 2 Samuel 2:8 has Ponto Krator, where the Masoretic text has Sabayot. This evidently didn't bother Paul, even though he had other options, as we see from Romans 9:29, where, quoting from Isaiah, Paul simply transliterates Sabaoth as Sabaoth. Notably, what Paul doesn't do in either case is to use a direct translation. The discussion above about how to translate Yehovah Sabaoth brings to mind an issue that rarely surfaces in the discussion of differences between Bible translations. Perhaps because this is not really an area of difference, there's great uniformity of practice across the translational spectrum, namely how to handle the divine name. Of all words, this one is surely inspired. Of all words, this one must be maintained, unmolested by the ravages of functional equivalence. That even the ESV follows functional equivalence practice in this special instance, translating Jehovah as Lord, or in modern biblical typographic convention, Lord capitalized. Following Tyndale, the Vulgate, Septuagint, the Masoretic vocalization tradition, and so on. It hardly needs to be pointed out that whatever the precise meaning of Jehovah, its closest, most essentially literal English equivalent is not Lord capitalized. Yet this is how the ESV translates the very name of God thousands of times throughout the Old Testament. I am not suggesting that ESV's choice in this matter is wrong. I am suggesting that it is contrary to consistent adherence principles of essentially literal translation and contrary to the condemnation of functional equivalence practices on the basis of the latter's supposed incompatibility with verbal plenary inspiration. 3.4 confuses properties and treatment of the original text, original versus translation. Reichen claims that dynamic equivalence is based on elementary confusion of translation with interpretation. Ironically, Reichen's conception of the ideal, essentially literal translation is, at least partially, based on his elementary confusion as regards the categorical difference between the original text and translation. In fact, he often writes in a way that seemed to belie his confusion on this point. Anyone involved in translation will know that the question is not whether the translation involves interpretation, but what kinds of interpretation are involved and to what extent interpretation is made explicit. Perhaps this should not be surprising given Reichen's lack of training on these issues. He has also acknowledged in a public forum that he does not know and has never studied Hebrew or Greek, and he knows no modern language other than English, and has never attempted to translate anything. I find that extremely hard to believe. I'm going to check that out. He's got a doctorate. For example, at the very beginning of his Understanding the English Bible Translation, Reichen characterizes dynamic equivalence theory as applied in English translations as holding, wrongly he thinks, that translators should feel free to give English readers a substitute for the actual words of the original Hebrew and Greek texts. Of course, translators must do precisely that. Otherwise, they are simply scribes, transmitting the Hebrew and the Aramaic and Greek texts rather than translators. In another place he writes, we never know when a dynamic equivalent translation gives us the real thing and when it gives us a substitute or an added overlay of editorial commentary. It is not knowing that is a part of the problem. Again, Reichen wrongly envisions translation as ideally giving up the real thing, and wrongly characterizes dynamic equivalent translations as a substitute, whereas all translations substitute receptor language words, idioms, metaphors, and so forth. In short, Ryken often applies principles to translation that should be properly applied to the original language. Contra Ryken's many claims, functional equivalence in translation is not tantamount to tampering with or changing the wording of the text in original languages. He is basically right to claim that fixedness of the text is a literary principle, but he seems to misunderstand that the text whose fixedness is crucial is the original text of the scriptures, the standard against which all translations are checked, and not the text of Ryken's preferred translation. We're going to really check that, whether Dr. Phil Ryken never studied Greek or Hebrew, quite to claim in print too. We turn now to Anglican and Episcopal history, and we're looking at the paintings of Thomas Cole, who came from England from a dissenter tradition, came to New York, married into the Episcopal Church, and became famous as a landscape artist. We pick up there. These plans for St. Luke's and the Catskills were simplified Gothic design with lancet windows, a design quite popular in the Episcopal Church of that era. Still later, Cole painted an illusionist window on one of the walls. Cole also became a close friend of two successive rectors of St. Luke's. St. Luke's is the name. The Reverend Joseph Phillips, who officiated at his marriage, and the Reverend Louis Legrand Noble, who ministered at his deathbed and presided at the funeral. Noble, who followed Phillips as rector in 1844, was a graduate of the Episcopal Church's General Theological Seminary in New York City of the class of 1840. Noble was a poet and high churchman influenced by the Oxford movement. A movement which emphasized the Catholic heritage of the Church of England. That's quite wrong. Emphasized the Roman character of the pre-Reformation Church. Get it right, son. In somewhat nostalgic and romantic way, which was then quite popular in the Episcopal Church and at General Seminary. It became a hothouse for Tractarianism. Noble's influence on Cole was quite marked, and in 1853, Noble became and remains Cole's principal biographer. Noble's account is not always accurate, although much of what is known about Cole's life, especially of his Episcopalian religious development, must be drawn from it. An untitled minute book of congregational and vestry meetings from Cole's time is in keeping with St. Luke's Parish in the Catskills. It has come to light and now provides additional glimpses of the life in the Episcopal Church and confirms Cole's activity independently of his biographer and even before the time that Noble was called to be the rector at St. Luke's. Cole was appointed to the Parish Building Committee in 1840, and the minutes of that year show this committee, with Cole, a member, active in superintending the building of the new church, procuring a hall, financing an organ, painting the roof, liquidation of debts, and effecting a loan. Cole was among those pledging a contribution in 1840 to raise the salary of the first rector he knew, Reverend Phillips, who married him, and in 1844 was an active member of the committee that called Phillips' successor, the Reverend Noble, who buried him and subsequently became his biographer. In 1844, 45, and 47, the vestry minutes show that Cole was one of the elected lay delegates from St. Luke's to the annual conventions of the Episcopal Diocese of New York, and the Diocesan Convention Journals show for these years that he attended and participated. Cole had first been elected delegate in 1840, but in the Journal of the Diocesan Convention, there's no evidence he attended in that year. In the annual parish meetings from 1843 until his death, Cole was elected as a member of the vestry itself. In the 1840s, Cole also developed an interest in early Christian catacombs, and he published with knowledge and appreciation for the subject in the High Church periodical, The Churchman, 31 October 1846. Cole's increasingly and profoundly religious turn of mind in this period is revealed in his poems, essays, sketches, journals, and other writings that were collected in two substantial volumes published by Matthew Timm in 1972 and 1980. It is said that at least by the 1840s, Cole always paused to prepare to pray before he began to paint. In the time following his entry to the Episcopal Church, Cole pursued the painting of his second great allegorical series, The Voyage of Life, done in two sets or versions over the years 1839 to 42, which was more explicitly religious in content than the course of the empire. In keeping with the developing views of the time, Cole already came to regard strict landscape painting as inferior in substance to allegorical and historical scenes. And from this perspective, he came to consider it the ultimate purpose of an artist to create works with ethical meaning that would depict the evolution and destiny of mankind. And we turn now to the next journal, the Churchman, Alan Bard's article on holiness in 1 Corinthians. We will finish this. This will be our last for this segment. Holiness in the gospel. Possibly litigation and divisions at Corinth could have been caused by a concern for holiness, but Paul's discussion of the proclamation of the cross and resurrection does not fit even a broad definition of holiness as love. Salyer notes Trinitarian basis across time for Paul's appeal. The history of God's dealing with his people, his present work with the people in Christ, and by the Spirit and the final fulfillment of that work in the resurrection and its implications. So for Hoffman, the inextricable link between faith and obedience is therefore framed theologically by the cross and the resurrection of Christ. Both ecclesiology and eschatology are rooted in one's understanding of Christ according to the Scriptures. Soteriology could be added to this list also. The context, too, is suggestive of the gospel motive. Paul could not have picked a more appropriate place to plant the seeds of the gospel than in a city with many visitors and a mixed Greco-Roman culture. First Corinthians, though challenges culture with timeless wisdom, cross, and spirit, a simple gospel, the person and work of Christ, which provides a single focal point for understanding reality. So the gospel defined as personal salvation, the life of Christ and social transformation lies behind the complex matrix of Paul's concern. As A.R. Brown and D.B. Martin, among others, argue, this unifying theme of the epistle is reproclamation of a different value system of grace, gifts, the cross, the resurrection's divine verdict, criterion, and status bestowal within the new framework of respect and love for the less esteemed other. The conclusion, Paul's concern in the gospel, which announces the way of salvation, that's his prime concern. Obstacles to the Corinthians' faith were strong cultural temptations toward idolatry, sexual immorality, and greed. Pride was dividing the church, and expectations of the future needed correcting. The solution was love for each other, patience, expectant hope in God. Paul's letter makes use of intertwined metaphors for God's people, which are conceptually linked around the core theme of holiness. This includes both relational unity and purity. Tension with the theme of faith is resolved if we recognize this is framed by Paul's concern for the gospel and grounded in Paul's Second Temple Jewish background. In this way, we can affirm that as a relation to a holy and loving God, the nature of Christianity is centrally determined by the concept of holy. Bring that and this section to a close. The Lord be for us, who can be against us? May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and fellowship of the Holy Ghost be with us all evermore. Amen.